Ephesians chapter 2 will be our first passage we'll look at together this morning. Ephesians chapter 2. Some of the younger children are studying in the book of Acts right now, and they studied about Eutychus this morning. And one of my little girls came up to me and she said, "Daddy, don't preach too long this morning. I may fall asleep." But what you need to know is that if you fall to your death like Eutychus did, I don't have the power to raise you up again. But I will tell you, I have other intentions this morning I have other reasons, I should say, for wanting to keep my sermon a little short this morning. I have a very special lunch date this afternoon with a beautiful young lady. And I'm talking about Abigail, okay? So don't get too, there's no scandalous things here. This is a birthday lunch for Abigail. Her birthday was a couple of weeks ago, and I told her we've been delayed and unable to do it. And I said, "Sweetheart, where do you want to go for lunch?" And she said, "Daddy, I want to go to Five Guys." And you know, when your child asks for a greasy hamburger, you're doing some things right. I think she knows what Daddy wanted for lunch. So we'll do the best we can this morning to not keep us here for too long. Our theme this year, as you know, is from Nehemiah chapter 4 and verse 6. We're keying in on the expression that the people had a mind to work. And in our last lesson last month, we talked about Satan's opposition to the work that we are doing as God's people. And we looked in the early chapters of the book of Acts at all of the assaults that Satan brought upon the church, how there were external problems and internal problems that Satan brought upon the early church in Jerusalem to try and get them to stop their efforts of proclaiming the name of Christ. And I said in that lesson that our emphasis was really more on the external challenges that happen, but sometimes our challenges as a church do not just come from the outside. They come from the inside as well. Problems can come from within. And that's what happened in Nehemiah chapter 5. When Nehemiah was gathering the people to rebuild the walls of the city, they came together in chapter 3. People from all walks of life were coming together to contribute to the work. And in chapter 4, there was some external opposition. There were enemies of the Jews who tried to stop that work from proceeding. And they came over those challenges. They were able to move beyond that. But then when you come into chapter 5, there comes some internal strife that Nehemiah has to deal with. And I'm not going to go over that in any detail. Several of you are in Joe's Nehemiah Bible class, and I know that you've just gone through that recently. So I'll skip over that. But the Jews in Jerusalem, for various reasons, were fighting with each other. They were at odds with each other, and there were many challenges that all led to internal strife. But God's people must stay together. We cannot let internal problems cause rift and division. In Psalm 133 and verse 1, the text says, "Behold, how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity." In Ephesians chapter 4 and in verse 3, the Apostle Paul said that we are to endeavor, to strive, to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. All of us have seen churches or heard of churches, maybe even been a part of one ourselves, that at one time or another was facing internal conflict and there was no peace. Maybe it was unresolved differences, often fueled by poor attitudes. And those things lead to conflicts that never go away if they are not handled correctly. Feelings get hurt. Problems are not dealt with. Members leave. Churches suffer. And in the end, Satan wins. So this morning, I want us to consider a very simple recipe for how to have peace in the local church and how to maintain peace in the local church. And I say a simple recipe. It's a simple recipe in the sense that the points are not complicated. But this simple recipe is sometimes difficult to carry out. It is sometimes difficult to implement and follow through on these things that I'm going to suggest to us this morning. Now, guys, my clicker's not working here, so I'm going to ask you to maybe unplug me and plug me back in or something like that. Whatever you have to do, whatever magic you have to do. And those guys are magicians back there. Thank you. All right. There are three things, three pieces to this recipe of maintaining peace in the local church. And while those guys are working to keep us up to speed there, I'm going to go ahead and give you the first one. And when you're ready, guys, put me on that slide with the first point. The first ingredient to the recipe, how to maintain peace in the church, is that each one of us must have a proper relationship to Jesus Christ. Each one of us must have a proper relationship to Jesus Christ. I had you open to Ephesians chapter 2. Look with me there, if you would, Ephesians chapter 2 and in verse 14, where the writer says, "For he himself is our peace, who has made both groups into one, and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall, by abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so that in himself he might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace, and might reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross, by it having put to death the enmity." You see, Jesus came to bring peace between God and man, but Jesus also came to bring peace between people. And what Paul has in mind here in this passage is the peace that Jesus brought between Jew and Gentile. Two nationalities who for so long had been separated by a number of things. But for 1,500 years, the Jews had been instructed in the law of Moses not to be like the Gentiles, not to marry the Gentiles, not to interact with them so that they would not fall under the same kinds of wickedness and fall under their influence. And these two peoples were separated for so long. But Christ came to bring them together. Did you notice in verse 16, it says that he would reconcile both of them in one body to God. He would bring these two bodies of people, these two groups of people into one body. I'm going to John chapter 10. Jesus talks about this idea here. John chapter 10. This is the passage you'll remember where Jesus calls himself the Good Shepherd. And he talks about the things that the Good Shepherd does for the sheep that are under his care. And in John chapter 10 and in verse 14, he says, "I am the Good Shepherd, and I know my own, and my own know me. Even as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep." But notice verse 16, where he says, "I have other sheep, which are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will hear my voice, and they will become one flock with one shepherd." Who are those other sheep out there that Jesus says must be brought into the flock, and this flock is going to be one flock, united under one shepherd? That's the Gentiles. Jesus is going to bring peace between these two groups. God's people share in a beautiful fellowship together. Jesus is our good shepherd, and each one of us is a sheep in his flock and under his care. And when the flock is united under the shepherd, there's peace under the shepherd's leadership. But in order for us to come together and have peace, we have to understand that our unity is based solely in Christ and not in anything else. any other unity, any other thing that brings us together that is not Jesus Christ is a false unity that will not last. You see, our unity in this local church, the basis of our unity is not political affiliation or commonality. There are other groups that exist for that purpose. Our unity is not based upon mutual social or recreational interests, that we all just happen to like the same things, and so we've decided to form some little club together so that we can pursue those social or recreational interests. That's what the YMCA is for, and other similar groups is that. Those things are all fine things, but those are not the basis of our unity. What brings us together in this local church is that each one of us has a relationship with Jesus Christ. That's the only thing that we share in common in the ultimate and spiritual sense. We may have other things in common. We may have other interests and things that might bring us together, things that we might enjoy some conversation over, but that's not the basis of our unity. The basis of our unity and our peace is our common fellowship with Christ. If it's anything else, it won't last. If it's anything else, it isn't real unity at all. What unites us, each one of us, no matter our background, no matter our age, no matter our ethnicity, our gender, our socioeconomic status, no matter what our occupation is, none of those things matter. What matters and what is the basis of our unity in this church is that each one of us has been purchased by the blood of Christ the Lamb. That's what matters. And that's where any discussion of peace and unity in a local church has to begin. Now, here's a second thing. And that is that we have to have a proper regard for the elders of the local church. I'm not going to put a percentage on this because I can't do it. I don't know what the percentage would be, but I suspect that many, if not most, issues that come up in a local church, they are somehow related to the elders. And I don't mean that the issue stems from the elders. It might. But what I'm saying is that somehow the elders may be related or involved in the issue. It may be that a church is trying to appoint some elders and that causes an issue. It may be that there is some problem that has arisen, but the problem was exacerbated because people don't like how the elders dealt with the problem. You see, somehow the eldership is involved. God has designed His body so that certain capable and qualified men serve His people as shepherds, following the model of the chief shepherd of John chapter 10. And the New Testament says that these men are to be honored and respected. I'm going to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Look with me, 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 12. But we request of you, brethren, that you appreciate those who diligently labor among you and have charge over you in the Lord and give you instruction. We're talking about the elders here, aren't we? When he says that there are those who have charge over you, that's the elders. And in verse 13, he says that we should esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Appreciate them, he says in verse 12. In verse 13, he says, esteem them highly in love, respect them, honor them, value them because of the work that they are doing. And I don't think it's by coincidence that the last expression in verse 13 is, live in peace with one another. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 13, and then I'll come back and make some comments about this. Hebrews chapter 13. Look with me there. Hebrews 13 and verse 17. Hebrews 13, verse 17. Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with grief, for this would be unprofitable for you. Obey your leaders. Submit to them. Obey and submit to the elders. Why? Because they're watching out for your soul. Are there elders who have abused their positions, turned it into some power trip, said things, done things that were inappropriate, applied force, coercion to their sheep? Yes. But that's the exception, not the rule. The elders have been given a task from God to love the sheep, to seek the interests of the sheep, to do that which is good for the sheep. And when elders do that, and when we know that they are looking out for our best interests, that they are doing what is best for us spiritually, then obedience and submission to the elders is easy. The congregation has responsibilities to her elders. Let's start with this one. Submission to their leadership. What does that mean? Well, we know what it means. Do what the elders tell us to do. Follow their lead. Accept their instruction. Accept their guidance. But you know what that might mean is that sometimes we don't get our way. Somebody brings an issue or a complaint to the elders and says, I need to tell you about this. You need to know about this. I want you to do something about this. And the elders take that complaint, they think about it, they talk about it, they analyze that situation, and they make a path forward. They make a decision. What if it's not the decision I wanted? I have to remember that the elders must act in ways that are good for everybody, not just in ways that are good for me. Well, the elders didn't do what I wanted. Maybe they didn't. But you see, the elders are shepherding a whole flock of sheep, not just one. We need to be fair towards the elders. I'm going to 1 Timothy chapter 5. I think this passage says something about this. 1 Timothy chapter 5, fairness to the elders. When Paul is writing to Timothy here, he says several things about the eldership and Timothy's relationship to the eldership and the eldership relation to the whole church. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 19. Do not receive an accusation against an elder except on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. If somebody comes along and starts to say something to you about the elders, and they start to speak ill of the elders and complain about the elders, can I ask you to do something? Don't listen to it. If somebody comes along and they make an accusation, one of our elders has done something wrong. One of our elders is caught up in some kind of moral infidelity or impropriety, something like that. They make the accusation. What does the passage say? It says, unless there's multiple witnesses, don't listen to it. The elders are oftentimes targets for criticism. Understand, I'm not talking about here in this church. I'm speaking generally. The elders are oftentimes targets of criticism, oftentimes unfair criticism. The elders are oftentimes held to a standard by people that is impossible, a standard that the Bible doesn't even give to the elders. Understand that just because a man is serving as an elder, that doesn't mean he's a perfect man. That doesn't mean that he has no flaws. Elders have to grow and learn too, just like all of us do. We need to be fair to the elders. I think one of the best things that we can remind ourselves of when it comes to the elders is to remember that the elders have the best intentions in heart. The elders are trying to oversee the entire flock. They're doing it with the best of intentions, seeking the best interests of the entire flock. And when we know that they are following the model of the chief shepherd, when we know where their heart is, that their heart is filled with love, that they want to encourage, that they want to admonish if necessary, but they want to do what's best for each member. If we will remember that, then being unfair towards them, being harsh and critical and judgmental towards them, that becomes much harder to do. The elders have responsibilities to the flock, just like the flock has to them. I've said some things about that already. But the elders have equal concern for every member. You remember Jesus said that a good shepherd will leave the 99 and go and seek the one. The one has value. Every member has value. And the elders must have equal concern. The elders need to present united leadership to the flock. If we don't want division in the church, we don't need to have division among the leadership. They need to be united if the flock is going to be united. But it seems that so many times when I hear about churches that are dealing with problems and issues, somehow the eldership is involved. And that's unfortunate. Because God did not design the local church in the way that He designed it in order to create problems. He designed it the way that He did so that peace would prevail, not issues. If each one of us has a proper regard for the elders, that will go a long way toward maintaining peace in the church. And I want to say something about that to this church. I've been speaking in general terms here, but let me say something to the Taylor's church about this point. I really appreciate the regard that we have for the elders. You hear it in our prayers. When you pray for them, you pray for God's blessings and God's wisdom to be upon them. I think you trust our shepherds, and that's because they're deserving of our trust. They have acted in ways that have been good and genuine and honest and true to God, true to the Scripture. And when they're doing that, that promotes trust in the flock. So I commend to you our elders, and I commend all of you as well for the attitude that you possess towards them. Now here's a third thing that we need if we're going to maintain peace in the local church, and that is that we have to have proper attitudes toward everyone. This is where it really gets challenging for each one of us, because sometimes attitudes are difficult to maintain. Good, positive attitudes, that is, can be difficult to maintain. I'm going to Genesis chapter 13. And this is not a passage about a local church. I understand that. But there's an expression here that's really beautiful and really powerful. Genesis chapter 13, this is the story where Abram and Lot have to separate because they both are men who are wealthy and their flocks and herds and servants are squabbling over territory. There's not enough pasture to go around, and so they realize that they must separate. And look in verse 8 at what Abram says to his nephew Lot. Please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Please let there be no strife between us. We are brothers. Isn't that a beautiful expression? A beautiful sentiment. I don't want problems to exist. We are brethren. And if that kind of sentiment is expressed among each one of us, our attitudes toward each other will be affected. The way that I treat you will be affected if it means something to me that you're my brother, that you're my sister. What are some of these attitudes that we have to possess? Love, that's the first one. That's no surprise. Love. Love is really perhaps the most pervasive and far-reaching of all of the things that we might mention. Love is behind all of them. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, you know this passage well, where Paul says that love has certain qualities that it possesses. Love has certain actions that are displayed. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, I want to read this because I know it's familiar, but I want to read this because I want us to remember the context of this book. When Paul writes to the Corinthians in this letter, every page there's a new fire that he has to put out. There's a new problem that he deals with on every page. How are they going to overcome these problems? Chapter 13 is the answer. He says in verse 4 that love is patient. Love is kind and is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant. It does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own, is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. This is what love does. And love is the solution to church problems. If the saints in Corinth have the right love toward one another, all of these problems that are going on there that Paul deals with in the book, they can be addressed and dealt with. Some of these things that Paul says here in this passage. Love is patient. Sometimes our problems in a church come from a lack of patience. And we might want to say, well, so-and-so was impatient, and that's what led to the problem. Is it? Paul says here that if I'm impatient, that might be an indication that there's not as much love within my heart as there needs to be. Because if I was loving, I would be more patient. He says that love is not jealous. Envy, jealousy. Does that ever cause problems in a local church? Of course. But are not envy and jealousy just symptomatic of a lack of love? In verse 5, he says, love does not take into account a wrong suffered. That's one that leads to a lot of church problems. I feel like I've been wronged in some way, and I'm going to take vengeance, or I'm going to turn it around, and I'm going to create another problem. Well, this person has done me harm, or this person sinned against me in some way, taking into account a wrong suffered. I might also add to that love does not take into account a wrong perceived. You know, sometimes we feel like someone has wronged us or sinned against us in some way. But maybe our perception is just wrong. Too often churches split and divide over problems that could have been avoided if brethren had just acted like brethren should. And love is the biggest piece of that. Here's another big piece: respect. Mutual appreciation. Mutual regard for one another. I got a few points on this one, but I'm going to skip over one of them just for the sake of time. Go with me to Romans chapter 14. I do want to talk about this one. Romans 14. How do I show respect for each member? Well, one way I do that is by respecting the principles and the scruples of another. In Romans chapter 14 and verse 1, Paul says, "Now accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. One person has faith that he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats vegetables only. The one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat, and the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him." Ronnie, we could preach on Romans 14 for a couple hours, I think, but let me just summarize it this way. Here we're given an example of two people. One who only eats vegetables, he's called the weak man. One who eats meats and vegetables, and he's called the one who has faith. Or we might call him the strong man. This is not a matter of right or wrong necessarily. This is a matter of personal conviction and judgment. And you say, well, why does this person only eat vegetables? Well, in the first century, there was this practice of offering meats that have been, or offering meats to idols. And somebody might say, look, I don't want to eat meat if it's been offered to an idol, but how do I know if it's been offered to an idol? Therefore, just to avoid the whole situation altogether, I'm just not going to eat any meat. I'm only going to eat salad. Is that a legitimate conclusion that someone might reach? How do I know if this meat's been offered to an idol or not? I don't want to participate in that, and since I can't know for certain, I'm just not going to eat meat. That's a legitimate conclusion that someone might reach. Paul says, don't let these issues of judgment become issues that divide. These two people have different judgments on certain matters, but the important thing that Romans 14 tells us is that both people are accepted and approved by God. That's what matters. So we're not talking about matters of sin here. We're not talking about matters of evil versus righteousness. God doesn't accept evil people. But this man has a certain conscientious scruple that he just can't get over. Paul says, accept that man. Don't judge his conviction. Accept him and respect him. The strong man is not to belittle the weak man. The weak man is not to think less of the strong man. Both are acting upon their conscientious convictions, and both are accepted before God. There's other things that Paul says here, but notice in verse 13, he says, therefore let us not judge one another, but rather determine this, not to put an obstacle or a stumbling block in our brother's way. So this weak brother who only eats vegetables, don't invite him over to your house for a barbecue. That's putting a stumbling block in front of him. Oh, go on with your silliness. Just eat this. It's really good. You don't know how long I smoked this. That's putting a stumbling block in front of him. That's casting judgment upon his convictions. Paul says, don't do that. And he says, if you do that, verse 15, if because of food your brother is hurt, you're no longer walking according to love. You're not loving this man when you pass judgment upon his conviction. And in verse 15, he says, do not destroy with your food him for whom Christ died. You know, about the only way I can eat a salad is if I smother it in pulled pork. But not everybody shares that conviction. And we don't sit in judgment of one another. Instead, what we do is what verse 19 tells us to do, and that is to pursue the things which make for peace and for the building up of one another. Mutual respect. One other attitude that needs to prevail. I'm going to mention it, but I'm not going to develop it. 2 reasons. One, this is a horse that I've been riding in my Bible class for about a month. So some of you are tired of hearing this. But the second reason is because I think I have a sermon coming up where I'm going to ride this horse a little more. But the other attitude that we have to have is humility. Humility towards God, yes, but humility towards one another. In our Philippians Bible class, we've been talking about this a lot. Paul writes there that we are not to act from selfishness or conceit, but we're to put each other's interests before our own. Humility causes me to give preference to you, not to myself. We have to make the determination that we are going to think as we ought, that we're going to act as we ought. And when each one of us conducts ourselves as Christians should, determined to maintain peace, then peace will prevail. There is something to be said. There's many things to be said about a spirit of peace that prevails in a church. I've had insomnia all my life. It's not because I drink so much coffee. I know that's what some of you were thinking, but that's not it. I drink the coffee because of the insomnia. It is not the cause of the insomnia. Sometimes it's hard for me to go to sleep at night. But you know what keeps me awake at night is not worries about problems in this church. That's not what keeps me awake at night. That's not to say it never happens. But you know, there's preachers, elders, concerned members in churches all over the world who constantly have on their minds problems, issues, and division that may be coming into their congregation, if it's not there already, because there is not a spirit of peace that prevails. We want to keep that spirit here. I shared some of these thoughts with a fellow preacher, friend of mine, a long time ago. And this man serves as one of the elders, or served, I should say in the past, as one of the elders before his wife passed away a couple of years ago. And he said, we have a practice among our eldership. I'm not sure if he was joking or if he was telling the truth. Maybe he was telling the truth. I don't know. But he said, you know, we have a practice among our eldership. When we meet with new members, he said, what we tell them is, we are a peaceful church. We're a happy church. And we plan to keep it that way. And if those are not your plans, we really don't want you to come. Now, you have to know this guy. His demeanor and spirit, even if he said it, you'd laugh and think it was funny. I don't think he was aggressive or combative at all when he said that. But maybe that's not a bad thing to say. Just to make the point that what we're after is peace. What we're after is harmony and unity in the Lord Jesus. And if we have these 3 things in place, then peace will prevail. There's a lot more that we could say about this, and we'll do that at some other time. But this is the simple recipe for maintaining peace in the local church. I appreciate your attention this morning. We pray for peace in this church regularly. But let's think back to where we began this morning, Ephesians chapter 2, where the text says that Jesus Christ is our peace, who came to bring peace between God and men. And there are people, even here this morning, who may not have that peace with God that we want you to have. Why are you not a Christian? What's holding you back? What's preventing you from sharing in this peaceful fellowship with Jesus Christ? That's what we want for you, and we want to help you even this morning. And if we can help you, we invite you. Please come as we stand and sing together.